Hello and welcome to session 2 of the Fold to Pattern Room and Shade with the CordlessPRO wideband lift sheet. So far, all we've done is work on the body of the shade or the rectangle. And last week was a lot of figuring based on the pattern motif. That is the most questions I had. So we're going to review that just a little bit before we keep going and finishing our shade. So here's where we left off last week. I had a rectangle with a hem and the side hems. So that's the finished width and the finished length plus a board mounting allowance, which was 2 inches. And I have a template. So I used a plastic template and I used that for cutting. And now I can lay that onto my rectangle and see that it all is where I want it to be. That pattern repeat is, the line for the fold is at each pattern repeat that I wanted. I've got a picture area at the top. So far so good. The most questions I had, pretty much every question I had from last week was about pattern repeats and working out the math. I will admit, I am not a math wizard. I'm not, arithmetic was not a good subject for me. I was an art student. I went to college and studied fine arts. So it's interesting that I have a career that's math centric. Who knew? Anyway, I think the sticking point where people got stuck was that divide by an odd number. So when using a fabric without a pattern repeat, dividing by an odd number works out great. So you divide by an odd number, you have an even number of sections between the rings, and then you split that last section between the top and bottom. And of course you subtract your head rail before you divide. That gives you, the perfect formula. But when you're working with a pattern repeat, you have to be a lot more flexible. It could work out using that formula, dividing by an odd number, based on your shade length and your pattern repeat. It doesn't hurt to do the math and see if it comes in close to your pattern repeat. And then you can adjust the top and bottom. But you also can just take your pattern repeat and see how it fits in your shade between that top and bottom. You know that you want your bottom hem to be at least half of that vertical ring spacing. So whatever half of your pattern repeat is. If you're folding more than one fold per repeat, you have to think about that. So you kind of have to work on that body, that section in between, and then see what's left over to split between the top and bottom. For that reason, you might have an odd number of sections and not an even number of sections. That's what happened with my shade. I tried to go with an even number of sections and realized I didn't have enough fabric to have a hem and have enough at the top. So I had to round down. So I had 5 sections between the top and bottom rings. So the pattern repeat is gonna bully you into not following the formula. It's okay. It's all about pattern matching. And the shade may have a reveal at the bottom underneath that last fold, like mine is going to have. It might have a little extra at the top, which would be fine if you're setting a top stop limit and the shade's not going all the way up. Maybe it's a really tall window. And with the spring system, you have to be able to reach that pull tab. So you might not have to have the shade go all the way up and have that top fold perfect. You can have some play and wiggle room there. Also, keep in mind that a lot of times you have a little wiggle room with your window. So if you have 12 inches above the window, maybe you can raise or lower where you plan to mount the shade a little bit. If you need 2 inches to make it work out perfectly for your bottom hem, lower it 2 inches or raise it 2 inches. So I just have a little bit of flexibility. And this is one of the hardest things to teach because people want a formula. But it's also a big part of doing custom window treatments because everything is custom. Every project has a different fabric, different length, and different pattern repeat. All right. Now that that's out of the way, and thank you to Julie and Sharon for sending your photos of your fabric. It helps me a lot when I can visualize and see things. So I'll be interested to see what you end up doing with your fabric. So and if you have any questions while I'm talking away here, please put them in the chat, and I'm going to check that right now. Okay, what if you do if your client specifically either doesn't want a reveal or ask for a 4-inch reveal? If they ask for a 4-inch reveal, you need to kind of put that in to the formula at the beginning, just like you do for the lift system. So you're going to block out that lift system space. You can block out a reveal space as well. And that's something you'll want to do when you have maybe an inset tape trim on the bottom, or you're doing a trim, down the sides and across the bottom that's mitered. So making the template is really, really helpful. If you can draw that out on a template, and then you can get that to work out. Hopefully, if they want a specific reveal of fabric, maybe they'll give you a solid fabric to work with, and that would be easier. But your first bottom ring is going to be really, really high up if you want to have a big reveal below the bottom. All right, so now let's continue making the shade. So I've got this rectangle, I've folded over the hem, and I'm using a fusible stiffener in the bottom hem. This shade that I'm making is really large. It's already heavy, and I don't really need a weight bar. A lot of times the weight bar is necessary to operate the shade, especially if you're using a clutch. A clutch system needs that friction, needs the weight so that the bead chain turns the clutch properly. The traversing clutch, the same thing. So on this shade, it's spring driven. The shade's already really heavy because I don't know why, but I decided to make this really big shade for the class project instead of making a little teeny sample. I thought it'd be more realistic to make a big shade. And this shade is heavy. I don't really need a weight bar in the bottom, but a lot of times a weight bar also helps to keep a nice, even, level bottom hem if you drop a weight bar in the bottom hem. So if I was to add a weight bar, in addition to this stiffener I'm using, I would use a flat aluminum weight bar. Not really heavy, but just something flat and square that will hold the hem square. The stiffener I'm using is from Dufix. You can also use something like Peltex or Peltex 71F, which has a fusible on it. The Dufix stiffener does have a fusible. So this is like a really, really heavyweight buckram. It's a woven. If you have an account with Dufix, they only sell to the trade. I need to get the number. I don't have that on this slide. So I'll make a note about the stiffener that I am using for this hem. And I think it's on a 10-inch wide roll. But I will send that as a follow-up in the email, the class follow-up, when I send the recording of which stiffener that I'm using here. And sometimes I just keep things on hand, like different weights of interfacing. So keeping a heavyweight interfacing on hand is great. You also could use buckram if you have rolls of buckram already, but I needed a really wide piece. So I was able to cut down what I needed. And this shade will be operated with a pull tab. So you're reaching behind the hem. Every time somebody reaches behind that hem, especially when the shade is all the way down, their arm is going to hit it, or their hand will brush against it, or they might lift up the hem to see the pull tab. So you want something in that hem to keep it stable so that it won't get wrinkled there or sort of pooch out there. Okay, so even though the pull tab's there, all they have to do is reach up behind there, they still might mess with the bottom fold. So having a stiffener in the hem is recommended by me. And now we're going to cut the inner lining. And I'm using Hanes heavy flannel in white. That's what I keep in stock. I'm starting by cutting off the selvage edge off one side, and then I'm going to line that up even with one side of the shade. You want to make your cuts at least the finished length plus 2 inches, but I have mine a little more generous than that because I'm whacking it off the bolt and I don't always cut straight when I do that. So just a matter of lining up the shade and smoothing it out. So it's not part of the project that uses a lot of your brain cells, which is nice after all the math and figuring the folds and the pattern repeats. You don't have to use inner lining with the shade. It does add extra weight. Inner lining does not block light on its own. It does sort of diffuse light. It does make the face fabric softer. It makes the folds a little softer and more rounded and not as crisp, which I like. It also adds insulation. So if you are making a shade that you want to insulate the window against heat and cold, this would help do that better than just lining. So now I've smoothed out and ironed the inner lining, folded it over to the finished width, and I'm trimming away the excess. You want to trim with a little reveal showing there. You don't want to have it too tight inside the side hem. So maybe an 1/8 inch less than, and then I'm trimming off the bottom even as well. So your rectangle of inner lining is fitting into all of your hems, fitting into your side hems and all the way to the bottom. If I was not adding that stiffener to the hem, then I could have let the inner lining go down into the hem to make the hem more robust and more padded. And now add the lining. So for this, this shade, I'm using the Premier Sateen from Angels Distributing. It's 100% cotton. Really nice lining. I like the 100% cotton lining. Some people prefer a cotton polyester lining, and that's okay too, whatever your preference is. And I'm doing the same thing, trimming off the selvage, lining up one side, smoothing it out. I love my wooden rulers for that. Iron it if you need to. And as I'm ironing, notice that I'm starting on the side that's even and ironing towards the opposite side. And you can see a little bit of excess material sort of being pushed over to the side. That's a good thing. You don't want to push all that in the middle. You want to work it off the other side before you cut off the lining. And now I can fold that over about 1/8 of an inch from the outside edge. You don't turn linings into the side hems on shades, on Roman shades, like I would do on draperies. On draperies, I love to have the inner lining rolled into a side hem, but because this has to fold up, you don't want bulk on the edges. because it'll fold up a little differently than the rest of the shade and give your shade, it'll start bowing in the center. So you want your side hems to be as flat as possible. And now I can tuck under the lining, under the side hems and the bottom hem. And that's ready for the rings. Now my slide showing the stiffener in the hem was a little out of place. I would put it in now. You could see how floppy that bottom hem was. So it was placed inside the hem, behind the lining, and then ironed in. So it's inside of that double fold. And now to finish the hems and mark for the shade rings. I'm using fabric glue, like Rolly Fringe adhesives for the side hems. There's a shot there just showing you what, if you're putting in a weight bar. And then sewing up the bottom hem on the sides and across by hand sewing. I'm using a ladder stitch, which is a stitch that goes from one side straight down like rungs of a ladder, and then the other side and up like that. I'm using a double thread. The fabric is heavy and stiff, especially I have that stiffener in the hem now. The side hems on a Roman shade are always under the bottom hem. So on a drapery, it's the opposite. But you don't want to look up at the shade and see the side hem turned under on those sides. So the bottom hem is always on top, but that gives you these side areas that need to be finished off, and they're often eye level. You can certainly, use a fusible product if you wanted to sandwich that together, but nothing pulls the fabric together like hand sewing. So hand sewing gets into the weave. The threads pull the fabric in. So I still like doing those edges by hand sewing, even if I'm using a fusible product on the rest of the shade. So now let's go a little faster. So I did glue the side hems. The Roman shade rings, when we sew them on, will hold all the lining in place. You never have to worry about the lining falling out of the side hems, because I'm going to be sewing rings up the side of the shade next to the side hems. If you do use a fusible product on the side hems, and you're using something like a double-sided tape, sticky tape, like Jules tape, just make sure that you don't put your rings in that area, that your rings are onto the lining and not where you're going to be sewing through the sticky tape. You could certainly hand sew the side hems if you wanted to. Any method that'll keep the shade on the table. So you don't want to go to the blind hemmer. I don't recommend that. So I would use a glue, an iron-on adhesive tape, double-sided sticky tape, or hand sew the side hems. And a lot of that depends on what the fabric is. If I didn't have inner lining in this shade, I might not have used a wet glue because it might have come through to the front. You might want to do a test first before you make a decision about a fusible product. So now that the shade's done, we have a lined rectangle. So last week we ended up with a rectangle of fabric. Now we have a lined and inner lined rectangle, and you need to plan your vertical and horizontal ring spacing. So we know our vertical ring spacing. We spent an hour last week figuring out our vertical ring spacing. Now you need to know the horizontal ring spacing going across. And just going to do a couple quick questions before I go forward, since they might be about the previous slide. Okay, Julie's asking, if you hand sew the side hems, do you go through the lining and inner lining? On a Roman shade, you don't need to. On a drapery, I do, about a hand width apart. I'll make a little stitch to the face to hold the layers together so it doesn't billow out. With a Roman shade, This shade is going to have 25 rings sewn on the fabric that'll go through from the lining side to the face fabric. So the lining will never billow out. So that's why you can use an adhesive product. You don't need to catch the face fabric. And what type of iron-on adhesive do you use? When I use it for low bulk headings on my panels, it never stays. Sharon, I like the Bort & Fix tape from DoFix. You do need a boiler iron for that. And you have to test your fabrics first because you really have to steam it. You don't just, lightly touch it with the steam iron. You really have to steam it to liquefy that glue into the fibers of the fabric. I really like to use a wet glue like Textile Tack-It or Rolly Company fringe adhesive, or a fabric glue. You could get at a craft store like Arlene's or Sobo glue. Once a wet glue gets into the fibers and dries, you can't pull it apart. It's really a good bond. So I do like the DoFix tapes. And also some of the fabrics have finishes on them that resist some of the glues. So it's always a great idea just to test these things first. So for the horizontal ring spacing, you have your template that you made to plan your vertical ring spacing. For horizontal ring spacing, the rings are sewn in columns as if you were having lift cords. So this shade does not have lift cords, but we're still gonna mentally plan it as if we were. So we're gonna have columns of rings. And you want them to be 9 inches or apart or less. This is my own preferences, 9 inches apart or less without ribs, like the shade I'm making, or 12 inches or less with ribs in the shade. So the rings are going on the inside of the side hems. I use 2-inch side hems in my shades. So subtract 4 inches from the finished width and then determine the best spacing, whether you have ribs in your shade or not. So for my shade, it's 36 inches wide minus 4 inches. Divided by 4 is 8-inch vertical ring spacing. So whatever you divided by, you're going to have one more for the columns of rings. So if you divide by 4, that means you'll have 5 columns of rings, 8 inches apart, like that. And you also need to think about that top section. How much space do you have above where you've marked for, or on your template, the top of that last fold? Do you need those rings at the top of the shade? If the rings are too close to your lift system, the shade might sort of pull in as it's going up for a corded shade. For a lift band sheet, you don't quite have that problem, but you don't want it crowded at the top. So it depends on the spacing that you have. So it all depends on how much extra you've added up at the top to work with your pattern repeat. So I can't tell you whether or not you need to have your rings at the top. But I do know for my shade, the rings were too close. They were right up underneath, like 4 inches from the top. So I got to eliminate those. So that's less rings to sew on. Yay. So you can see that when I lay my template there, I don't need rings on this top section, at the top of my 5th section at the top. Remember, I've got a board mounting allowance at the top there and my head rail there. That would put the rings right up under my roller tube. So I can go down and stop my rings at the previous line. And you might be able to do that too. It just depends. If you had a lot of fabric after you figured out your pattern motif, if you had a lot of inches left over that you had to sort of feed to the top, then you might need to have rings at the top of your template. So for my shade, No rings needed now at the top area. So I have 5 columns of rings, 5 rings per row. So I need 25 rings. Now to mark for the rings. It's nice. You're marking to a pattern repeat. You also want to measure. You want to make sure everything's nice and square. I put a little pencil dot. You certainly could put a disappearing pen dot if you think that you're going to be sewing them on in a timely way. But a little pencil dot, one of these, I like these little mechanical drawing pencils, and just a little dot. And then I pin through it, and I pin through to catch the face fabric, the lining, and the inner lining. That allows me to move the shade around. I don't really crawl and get on top of my work table. So you see a lot of workroom folks will put pictures on social media of them on top of their work table, sewing on rings, on shades. That's because they're trying to keep their shade flat. Well, I pin through at each spot, and that way I can fold the shade up. As I'm sewing the rings on, I'll fold the shade up and just keep sewing. So I don't have to crawl on top of the table. And so you can see the ring spacing there. I have to start at the top of the bottom hem and then up to the top of the shade. And now, ring sewing. You want to catch the face fabric. You can use metal or plastic shade rings with the lift band sheet. Safety Shade did send a few rings in the kit, in my kit. I don't know if it was a sample pack, but it wasn't enough to make the shade. So that was the clear rings. They sell the forever clear rings. But I like the metal rings for a couple reasons. One is you can make a smaller stitch to the face because there's a smaller diameter. And also with the lift band sheet, we're going to be inserting battens into the rings. And these have a little bit smaller diameter on the inside of the ring. So there's not as much space for the batten to move around. So I like the metal rings, but you can certainly use plastic rings. They could be the clear ones or like a white plastic shade ring. So let's play the video.
So sew the rings on. I have each mark pinned through to the face that holds the shade together while it's moved around on the work table. I'm going to take a stitch here before I take the pin out. And that may or may not catch the face fabric. And then load the ring on and then take a stitch. You hear that? I sort of pricked against the canvas. And that way I know I'm going through to the front. Made 2 stitches. And then I'm going to stitch, not going through to the front, just an extra stitch so that I can make a knot. So make a loop here. And then go through the loop and pull it tight. And then loop the thread around and go through, just catch a thread. It doesn't matter how much. And then pull that tight. And then trim, leaving a tail. Now I did that very slowly. It goes faster. So let's do one without trying to be slow for the camera so that you can get a better idea of how long it takes. There you go. There's 2 rings sewn on. And now to keep sewing rings on the rest of the shade.
So the most important thing to point out here, well, two important things: catch the face fabric, that's important, but also the rings are oriented for battens or rods to go through the rings from side to side. You're not sewing the rings on for cords to go up and down. So you can see in this photo here, the rings are vertical and not horizontal. And it's really hard to get your brain around that if you've made hundreds of shades doing it the other way. So just remember, and you'll figure it out. If you do it wrong, when you go to the next step, you'll figure it out. Let me check the questions here. And can you please show us how you make a knot? It takes me a lot of time to make each knot. Well, Sharon, when you watch the replay of the video, maybe you can slow it down. I don't know. I can't slow-mo here, but it's just a matter if you're talking about a knot in the bottom of the thread or knotting when you're sewing your ring. When you're sewing, whether you're sewing a ring or hand sewing a side hem, take a stitch, leave a little loop, go through the loop, and then catch some a little bit of the fabric or a little thread, and go through again and go through the loop again and make like a little square knot. Oh, the bottom of the thread when you first start. Yeah, maybe at the end of class if I don't have one right on me right now. And the interesting thing is different people do that a different way. Lori Medford she knots the threads in the bottom of her thread completely different than I do. So it's funny to see that. Okay. And what thread do you use for sewing on your rings? Great question. I left that out. I use Coats Dual Duty hand quilting thread. And it's the hand quilting. It's very, very strong. It's holds up to the elements and the sun. I've never had a Roman shade ring fall off when using the Coats Dual Duty thread. You can get it in a lot of colors. If you have a coupon at Joann's, pick up some spools of colors, but most often you're going to use ivory and taupe and white. I also like the Coats Turco satin thread, and that is a very, very heavy duty thread. Much heavier. You can use it to sew in your industrial sewing machine. And that only comes in neutral colors here in the United States. And I like the hand quilting thread. I'll say that's what I've been using for many 30 plus years. All right, so now that we have the ring sewn on, I want to look at what's in your kit before I start putting all those parts together.
Let's review what's included in the CordlessPRO wideband lift sheet kit. The first thing is the lift sheet. And as I specified for the class, I wanted you to get the 10% openness and not the blackout sheet. The reason being a blackout shade, the lift sheet doesn't provide enough blackout because it's open on the corners, so you still would have to make a blackout shade. So I much prefer this over the blackout material. A couple of reasons. It has this very clear weave. I can come in and you can see that or not. That makes it very easy to cut on a straight line. So this fabric doesn't fray. So in order to cut it straight, all you have to do is follow the line of the weave, and that makes it very easy. It's also easy to sew, and we're gonna have to sew a double rod pocket at the bottom and put in the pull tab. So I really like this material. And then you have acrylic rods. There are 2, and they go in the bottom of the lift sheet. There's battens. They're metal, covered in vinyl. and those are going to lift the shade. There's no cords. The battens lift the shade. You have an aluminum tube, and we'll have to cut that to the correct size. And the lift system has a spring unit. You can also get this system motorized. And then the end piece of the spring, one goes in one end and one goes in the other. The brackets, there's 2 brackets. And the screws. So I'm going to cover that up. Zip that back up because I don't want to lose those screws. And then J hooks. And this is what is on each side of the lift sheet. And the lift sheet goes into this little J hook and then lifts up and down. It's very interesting. So that's the J hook. You will also need a board. And that's it for the lift system. Safety shade is also included the forever rings, the clear forever rings. We're not going to use those. We're going to use metal rings, but they have them and that's good and that's fine. You can use those too if you'd like. But I'm going to keep those and put them back with, I have thousands of those rings because I really like them, but I'm not going to use them for this project.
Okay, before we move ahead, I went and got some dual duty hand quilting thread. So let me find that. And you also can buy this thread at wawak.com, WAWAK.com. And this is the Coats Turco Satin. There we go. And it's Tex 80, which is really heavy, but really great thread. And you can get this from the Workroom Marketplace. And I'm going to thread a needle and show you how to put a knot in. It's gross. Lick your finger. Bring it around and twirl it off. And there we go. So practice, practice, practice. Okay, so now that we've gone over what's included in the kit, now get out your J guides. I call them J hooks in the video. They're called J guides on the safety shade instructions. So let's get that correct. J guides, and we're going to attach those to the shade.
Here's one of the J guides, and I'm going to tie it on to the ring on the outside of the shade. So you're doing one side first. Don't do both sides. You're going to put on the J guides and then put the rods or battens in and then put the other side on. And I'm using 0.9 millimeter shade lift cord. There's a little hole on there that can go through. And then just tie it off to the ring, putting the short end in. The long end is going to end up being on top. And just tie it off however you wish to. I go one way and then come back the other way. And you do want it to be snug. Square knot there. Leaving a little bit of a tail and then add a dab of glue. Just so it doesn't come undone. All right, let's do one more. Put the 0.9 millimeter lift cord through the hole on the J guide. Put the short end in the ring. And then I'm going to just tie off the J guide to the ring. You can also sew them on, which I've done. The hard part with this cord is that it's hard to get it snug sometimes. So there we go. And That's why you add glue. Make sure that knot doesn't tease out.
And now the J guides are down one side of the shade, one side only. Doesn't matter which side. And now we'll cut the battens and insert those into the J guides. So I'm using a bolt cutter. The battens have been cut 4 inches less than the width of the shade. And I'm going to thread a batten from the opposite side through the rings and into the short end of the J hook. There's a little opening there. You may need to file off this end. It's vinyl coated, and when you cut it, it can be hard to get this shoved in there. The J hook has a hole in the short end and then a little split opening, and that does help to give a little ease, but you do want it to be good and tight. You can add glue to the end if you want to. I don't really think it's necessary, but they do say that in the safety shade instructions. And then it's just a matter of getting in there as far as you can. You can also tap it with a hammer if you need to. But the important thing is to make sure you slide the battens through the rings before you put it in that end. And then I can put the J hook in the other end. So the battens through the rings, and now I have to put on the other J guide. And this is why you don't tie these on yet, because you have to fit this on. So put that into the ring and then insert the batten. And again, you're going to try to wedge that in there. It's going to be really, really, really tight. And if you have a hard time with this, you may want to cut your battens a little bit shorter. I think that's as far as that one's going to go. And now I want to make sure that both of the J hooks are oriented in the same direction. So right now, the one on the other end is pointing the other way. So let me show you that. See how that one's pointing up towards the top of the shade? So I need to make sure that this one is pointing up to the top of the shade. And now they're both in the same direction. Now I can tie on this batten to get a piece of shade cord and go through the hole, through the ring. And I actually have a shade here at Workroom Tech that doesn't have the J guides tied on. Once you put that rod in, they're not going to fall off. But you should probably do that. They have a hole there for it, so you should do that. And then I'll add a little dab of glue right there. Okay, so we're coming along. Now it's time to board mount the shade, and then we'll finish up for today after the board mounting. And I am going to show a method for board mounting that's a little bit different than what you might usually do. I like to have a variety. So as you take more classes with us, you learn different methods. So I'm going to be mounting on the front edge of the board. You don't have to do that. If you want to staple on top of your board, that's great. It's a lot easier. But I wanted to pattern match and just to show you another method. It's also a great method to use if you're short on fabric and you only have a 1/2 inch. So sometimes that comes in handy. So here's the board mounting video. I'm ready to cover the board and attach the shade to the mounting board. And there's lots of different ways to cover and mount shades on boards or to cover boards for balances. And in every class, I think I do it differently. And that just shares a lot of different ways. As you take more classes with me and with Lori, you'll see different approaches to doing things. And for this shade, I'm going to mount to the front of the mounting board, which is a little different. So I wanted to show that. I'm going to start by covering the mount board. I'm using a 1x3, which is 2.5 inches deep. That's what the return is. And then it's a 3/4 inch board. So I'm going to be mounting on the 3/4 inch side of the board. To do this, you'll need some tack strip. And this is cardboard tack strip. Comes on a roll, or you can buy it in strips. And I like to use the 1/2 inch tack strip. And I have extra fabric because I want the top of the mounting board to look as pretty as the rest of the shade. So here's the extra fabric. I have a pneumatic staple gun. This is a Fasco staple gun, long nose, and I have it hooked up to the air compressor. So there's the hose. So the first thing is, I'm going to set the board aside, is to find the pattern match. That's the top of the shade. So I had marked the length on this shade by folding and pressing the top. I didn't draw a line. That helps to make sure that you don't lose anything. If I just drawn a line and then turned, I could lose fractions of an inch. And there's interlining in here, so it's kind of thick. So as you turn, you lose fractions of an inch. I could cover this board with lining or face fabric, serge off this edge, and staple it onto the top of the board. That would be fine. But we're going to mount on the front of the board just for something different, just to show you something different. So the mounting board will be like that. So I want the fabric to match what's on the front of the shade here. So to do that, I'm just going to bring my fabric over, find the pattern match. Here they are right here. I'll just fold that over and get that pattern match lined up with whatever's underneath is what I'm looking for. So I need enough to go around that way and around underneath. I've got plenty underneath. So I'm going to cut off here, making sure I have enough to wrap around. I want the top of the board to look neat, so I don't want to join the fabric on top of the board. And now I can take a look and see how that matches. I'll move the camera around so that you can see. So that's going to match right there. Nice. And I want to make sure it's centered. Looks good. I'm going to go ahead and put a staple in underneath. I'm not worrying about the ends. I can cut all that off later. It's mainly these daisy blossoms that need to line up. Wrapping the fabric around and put a staple underneath. I want the top to look nice. And let's get the center.
now I can trim away some of the excess off the ends, leaving about 2 inches. Don't cut your shade underneath. Cut away some of this excess fabric. Turn over the ends. And turn over the ends on this one. And I am going to add end flaps or return covers. And that will hide the brackets from the lift system. I have a lot of waste, so let me trim some of that off. I'd rather have things cut too big and you can whittle them away than not have enough. Turn under that end, just sort of tuck that in, bring it over, and it gives you a nice crisp corner. Hold the fabric tight and turn under the edge. Now this is going to be underneath the board. Now that goes right there. So now to staple the shade onto the board. I need to trim away the excess. Often I will serge across here, but I have all the battens and J guides on the shade already. I do not want to take it to the serger. So I'm going to cut a 1/2 inch from the fold line, not all the way through to the front of the shade. And the board is 3/4, so that means that the cut edge will be behind the board. This is Jules tape. It's a double-sided sticky tape. Very sticky on one side. I'm going to put that along the crease there, right above the crease. And with this tape, you sort of burnish it. So you can use like the edge of the scissor handle there. And peel the paper away. And now I can pattern match that onto the board. Starting at the end, working my way down. And it's very sticky. I want that top crease to be flush with the top of the board. I don't want the board sticking out above. There's a little bit here. I need to move it just a little bit. And right here, I could adjust it a little bit more. It's going to get stapled, so don't worry. I'm not just relying on the double-sided tape. Just makes it easier to get a pattern match. I'm satisfied with that. So that's all matched on the front. Fold this over one fold. You can see the lining and inner lining are not attached to that double-sided tape. And put the tack strip Now that's connecting everything together. All right. And there's my pretty pattern matched board.
I love that. Something very satisfying about a pattern match. Okay, so we're to the end of today's class. Let me check for any questions that you have here at the end. And so this week you need to work on getting your lining and inner lining if you're using it in your shade, your ring sewn on, and your J guides and rods into your shade. And one thing I didn't really show in the video, and that was measuring the length. So when I measure lengths on Roman shades, I measure and then fold over and press a crease at the finished length. That gives me a more accurate length than just drawing a line because of the take up of fabric. So the lining, the inner lining, and the face fabric, that thickness, you need to accommodate for that. So by folding it and getting your finished length, you get a more accurate length, and it gives you that nice sort of a right angle to set that board up against. And you also could draw a line as well and either staple across the top with a fabric stapler or put some pins in if you'd like to hold everything together. I always try to just keep the shade on the table as much as possible so that the layers don't shift and pull apart. And thank you, everyone. If you are behind in the project, it's okay. It's all about learning. This isn't a contest to see who finishes first. I don't give prizes for the person who finishes their shade first. And then next week, we're going to cut and attach the lift sheet. And that includes making a pull tab at the bottom, assemble the lift system, adjust the spring and stop limit. And I'll share some troubleshooting tips for adjusting the tension on your shade. And also we'll talk about pricing. So it's a lot. We have a lot coming up next week. If you have any questions during the week, please let me know. And I will send some additional resources today in the follow-up email. So look for that this afternoon. So thanks everyone so much for joining me, and go back to there, and have a great afternoon. Take care. See you next week.